Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. The fit for this video is DuckTales. Woo! Let's take a look at a video.
Dude, I'm telling you, this book, Case for Christ, the fucking history, it's not even an opinion. He's not saying I want you to believe. He's like, here's the history. Here's why we... Dude, so like, if I said to you, Joe, you believe...
I like it. He's about to start cooking. Let's go, Chris.
All right, let's see it.
Believe everything you've heard about Alexander the Great, right? You believe it, you know, he's fought in these battles. What they say, that you just believe it's Alexander the Great. I'll read his biography. You'd say, yeah, sure. But then you'd be like, oh, but I don't believe they made the shit about Jesus. Okay, Alexander the Great, because what you'll always hear is, well, the Gospels were written 100+ years after Jesus died.
No, they were written between 40 and maybe 80 or 90 years after Jesus died.
Alexander the Great's first biography was written like 300 years after he died. So that right there is like, well, the historians of Jesus were much closer in time than, say, Alexander.
So this is inaccurate and misleading. The first biographies written about Alexander the Great do not come from 300 years after his death. The first biographies written about Alexander the Great that still survive to this day come from a little under 300 years after his death. But they all quote by name from multiple earlier biographies and histories that no longer survive, except for, in quotations, scattered around a number of different texts. We know of at least 5 different people, better attested in the historical record than Jesus, who traveled with Alexander the Great, who were writing histories and biographies about Alexander the Great, either along the way or just after Alexander's death. Callisthenes was an official historian of Alexander the Great, who died before Alexander the Great, but wrote an extensive history that would later be criticized within a century later by Polybius for being extravagant and for claiming impossible things about Alexander the Great. Ptolemy was a general who wrote a history. Nearchus, Aristobulus, Onesicritus wrote a very inaccurate biography that was criticized by everybody around him. All 5 of these people also had biographies written about them by multiple other authors in the century or two after Alexander's death. Theophrastus was a friend of Callisthenes who wrote about Alexander the Great, putting Callisthenes to death. But we have other historians who say, no, that's not how Callisthenes died. He died in this other way. The earliest surviving history or biography of Alexander the Great is by Diodorus Siculus, who was writing in the middle of the 1st century BCE. Now, if we only focus on biographies, we are severely limiting the material evidence for Alexander the Great. For instance, we have numerous coins depicting Alexander the Great as Heracles in his lion headdress with Alexander's name on the other side of the coin that were minted during Alexander's life and then by his generals who were fighting over control of different parts of his empire during what's known as the Diadochi, the Wars of Succession. We also have Babylonian inscriptions like these that discuss Alexander the Great's death, that were written within a year of his death, or that discuss his activities during his life or shortly after his death. The material remains that directly attest to the life and even the actions of Alexander the Great are absolutely overwhelming. And they are often criticized for exaggerating, for elaborating, for making stuff up. So historians are very consistent about how they treat the weights of historical evidence for different figures. And the notion that the evidence for Jesus, as found in the Gospels, can compare in any way, shape, or form whatsoever to the evidence we have for both the life and the activities of Alexander the Great is absolutely laughable.
And even furthermore, back then, like the ancient Hebrews, they didn't have, before writing, they didn't write anything, so they would memorize the Old Testament and the Scripture. So that you had guys that they would pass down, right? They knew 5,000 pages of book at the side of their head.
That's a great point.
No, the claim that ancient Hebrews memorized 5,000 pages of text before writing is not a great point. Scholars have been studying the oral transmission of social traditions and their commitment to text for many, many years, and they've been taking that research and applying it to the study of the text of the Hebrew Bible. And while there's a lot of great insight to be found in that, the notion that it somehow elevates the historicity of the text that we find in the Hebrew Bible is nonsensical.
that most of the stuff we take at face value that history just kind of believes. We omit that there's more manuscripts and they're closer to Jesus's actual life than there are any other character from antiquity.
That claim is just pure and utter nonsense. There are numerous historical figures for whom we have direct historical attestation contemporary to their lives and their activity.
Only thing I would add to that is that the dates are even closer. The first Gospels were written 100 years after. They were written like 20, 30 years after. So, and there was books like First Corinthians was probably written 10 to 15 years after. I believe First Corinthians was written in 40 or 50 AD. So there's books that predate the actual Gospels that were in the New Testament.
So I would suggest that those dates are a little overly enthusiastic. But again, we have material remains and texts from the very life of Alexander the Great that name Alexander the Great and refer to his activities.